Now Taxes is 100% free when you file in the TurboTax app if you didn't file with us last year.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, just do your own taxes in the app by 2/18.
What if I have lots of forms?
All good, all 100% free.
What if I had 3 jobs?
Still 100% free.
What if I once saw Bigfoot?
That has nothing to do with taxes, so still 100% free.
Now that's what I'm talking about.
Now this is Taxes. See if you qualify in the TurboTax app. Excludes TurboTax Live, must start and file in app by 2/18.
You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at NORI, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Hello and welcome to the Reversing Climate Change podcast with NORI. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm one of the co-founders of NORI and the creative editor here. Today I have with me Siobhan, Montoya, Lavender of Thanks a Ton, and also a meme writer and author of memes. Hi, Shiv.
Redundant author. Hey, Ross, how's it going?
I think I messed up the taxonomy of what exactly that job should be called literally every single time I've introduced you, but glad you're here.
That's okay. I like that we haven't circled on it. I like that it exists in the nebulous space here. Also with us today is someone with a proper title. We have with us Erika Reinhardt, who is the co-founder and executive director of Spark Climate Solutions. Thanks for coming, Erika.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks so much. It's been fun.
Yeah, we are going to be talking to Erika today about methane, which is a topic I think we have not discussed enough on the pod and is growing in the cultural zeitgeist of interest, I believe. We shall see what the receptions are once we air this, but I believe that people really want to know what's happening with methane. And so today we're going to dive in. We're going to hear what the problem is with methane, what the solutions are, and then what Spark Climate is doing to address it.
I think the only other time that we've really spoken in detail about methane was near the beginning of the show's start with Julio Friedman. I remember we talked about dairy lagoons. And I think for a long time, I don't think I've heard anything about methane forever, because I know it's much more dilute in the atmosphere. People have got their hands full just trying to get carbon dioxide down, or maybe there's methane destruction and landfills and that sort of thing. But it's always come up tangentially.
I think I hear about it a lot now where I didn't before, or I'll say something about carbon dioxide removal and somebody will jump up and be like, what about methane?
Wow.
Which I think is an important
Okay.
interjection to have. So, okay, Erika, tell us why we should care about methane. I thought it was just about carbon dioxide. Why should we care about this greenhouse gas?
Methane has a surprisingly large impact on our warming, and I think it's often underestimated. So currently we have about 1.1 degrees C of global temperature rise, and half a degree, 0.5 degrees of that is from methane. So it's playing a really big role kind of right after CO2. And so as we think about what does it take in order to bring our temperatures down after we minimize peak temperatures, methane has a really important role to play in parallel with carbon dioxide, as well as all other greenhouse gases. So we want to make sure, don't get completely ignored here. I think part of the reason that methane recently has gotten a lot more attention is as we grapple with what it would take to stay under 1.5 or the 2C guardrails, given where we're at. Methane has to play a really important role in bringing temperatures, in limiting temperature increase and bringing temperatures down. And one of the reasons behind that is that methane has a somewhat unique role as a greenhouse gas in that it is short-lived. So when we emit carbon dioxide, it stays in the atmosphere for centuries. And this is where you get that bathtub analogy, right? We keep adding more CO2 into the bathtub. That's the spigot. And it's only with, opening the drain or scaling carbon dioxide removal that we can start bringing that level down. That is a really good analogy for carbon dioxide. It doesn't quite work that way for methane, in that methane does naturally degrade in the atmosphere over a few decades and kind of, quote unquote, go away by itself. And given where we're already at, given how much carbon dioxide there's in the atmosphere, given how many other greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, our climate models are fundamentally depending upon us dramatically reducing our methane emissions so that our atmospheric methane levels come down over the next few decades and basically free up some temperature buffer for that CO2 transition. And so at this point, there really is, no way of hitting these targets without methane playing a really important contribution to bringing down our overall emissions and helping to decrease the methane portion of our warming.
So if we are to ignore methane and just focus on other greenhouse gases, we would be ignoring roughly 25% of today's global warming. Is that true? That it accounts for roughly a quarter of temperature warming?
Even more than that, actually. I mean, so currently it's half a degree out of 1.1 degrees. So whatever that, 40-ish% that works out to be.
Wow, so super significant.
If you also look at today's emissions and you look at what impact those emissions are going to have in the near term, methane similarly has a really, really large role. And that is really because of how potent it is. So the global warming potential, which is kind of a measure of how potent a greenhouse gas is compared to CO2, is about 120 for methane right when it's released. And then it decreases over time. And so by the time you're looking at a 20-year average, you'll hear a number like 86. And once you're looking at a 100-year average, you're looking at something closer to 30 to 35. But it's incredibly potent. And so when we think about what impact our emissions today have in the next few decades, the impact of methane is quite large. And of course, this is the same time frame on which we're talking about how do we slow temperature increase as these impacts are becoming more evident. How do we minimize our peak temperatures if we are to hopefully succeed at achieving peak temperatures? And so methane can play a really important role in addition to dramatic carbon dioxide emissions reductions, as well as the scaling up of carbon dioxide removal to really enable us to peak our temperatures and bring those peak temperatures down, which will have many positive impacts directly on human society, as well as helping to reduce some of the natural feedbacks and tipping point risks that we otherwise face.
The explanation that I've heard, this is the PE teacher who has to fill in for the science teacher version, but that methane turns into CO2. At some point, it just becomes CO2 or degrades through UV or something like that. Or if you're burning methane, which is, as far as I understand it, the same as natural gas, it just turns into, or one of the byproducts is CO2. That's all correct?
So there's a number of different oxidation processes, but the primary output of those oxidation processes is carbon dioxide. So that is correct. That is kind of what the carbon and methane gets converted to. When you look at what happens when you emit methane into the atmosphere, what happens is that you have methane for some period of time, and then it goes through one of these sink processes. So one of these oxidation processes where it is converted to carbon dioxide and water usually, and a few other byproducts. And so while it is absolutely true that emitted methane does result long-term also in CO2, that long-term CO2 impact ends up being kind of a minor overall factor in comparison to that short-term warming, but it does lead to long-term warming as well.
It's pretty amazing that it could be improved, or the radiative forcing potential of this gas would be improved by converting it into CO2. Because I think people think of carbon dioxide as the main villain here, and maybe in general it is. But it's pretty interesting to think that in some ways CO2 would be preferable to methane.
Absolutely, and this goes back to the potent point, right? This little molecule is a strong little guy. And so as much as we can, first prevent them going into the atmosphere and then get them out of the atmosphere via that conversion process makes a big difference. From some very rough calculations, it looks like on a molecule by molecule basis, as opposed to a tonnage basis, that you can basically think about the warming impact of a molecule of methane being about 40 times as strong as a molecule of CO2, which just shows you how valuable that conversion is.
Yeah, I remember I listened to Ryan Orbeck on The Catalyst with Shao Kahn. This must have been like 6 months or a year ago, talking about how he wishes that offsetting and crediting were denominated in terms of radiative forcing rather than tonnage. I just dropped a big open question on you. I don't know if you saw the blended ton white paper that we published last week.
I did.
Cool. Like one of the possible blends for the future I was thinking is, what if you had end to end? You could do something like methane destruction, maybe you did like 1/40th of a molecule of methane was destroyed, and then you stored the carbon dioxide that resulted in a sink, a land-based carbon sink like soil for 10 years until you had a permanent removal come and stop it. Is that not like the perfect end-to-end solution for it's like a full cycle carbon asset that's blended together? That's the combo.
I love that we're going straight to radiative forcing credits here.
There we go.
So, I mean, in any, I think we just have to go back to what our core goals are, right? Which is making sure that we're mitigating overall warming as much as we safely can at every point in time. And so all these different approaches, permanent carbon dioxide removals, temporary carbon dioxide removals, potentially in the future, methane removals, all are going to have sort of different shape of impact, right? Of how much warming mitigation potential do they have and on what time frame. And so I think our collective job is to figure out how we can accelerate all these different categories of solutions, and then deploy them in appropriate and responsible ways to help to bring radiative forcing down at every point in time, independent sometimes of which specific gas it is, and instead make sure that we're pulling all of these tools together in the most comprehensive ways. We do need to be careful when we talk about any sort of crediting, that in those situations in particular where you're sort of setting up for there to be trade-offs between different activities, that those activities do fully cancel each other out. And so that sort of look at impact over time is particularly important. Of course, there are many ways of deploying solutions that don't create those trade-offs, and we should be pursuing those as aggressively.
How are you thinking about the time value of carbon? Should we be thinking about the radiative forcing over decades? Or I know a lot of the drive towards permanent carbon removal, my guess is a lot of it remains a political economy question where we're in a carbon accounting world and we don't want corporations to be greenwashing by burning fossil fuel and then negating it with temporary storage. But if you thought about it from a more radiative forcing angle, should we be looking at the decade scale? Is it more important to stop climate change in this century, and the permanence is a nice thing to think about later? How much of this is impacted by carbon accounting? Enormous question. Good luck, Erika.
Thanks for sending me all the easy ones today. I think about it differently, I think, which is
tell me.
That we need to be very aware of and prioritizing both near-term and long-term warming, and wherever we can, really pursuing both to the maximal degree, because these things shouldn't be traded off from each other, and we don't want to be making the problem worse for future generations to try to solve. And so I think our current carbon, the way we talk about metrics, for example, really is anchored around long-term warming, right? We talk about GWP 100. That is the average global warming potential impact of an emission averaged over 100 years. When we look at something like methane starts incredibly potent, right? About 120 times in the impact of CO2 on a per tonnage basis, and goes down significantly over time. And what we see is that when we start just averaging to 100 years, we actually lose those dynamics. We don't take those into account. And so rather than thinking about kind of at what point in time do you want to optimize? I'm really much more interested in how do we pursue actions that help us optimize it all, and just generally understand the system better. Because, for example, if we have really high overshoot on the way to coming back down and still by 2100 reaching 1.5, but say, you know, peaking at 2 degrees Celsius along the way, that has a lot of impacts. That has a lot of impacts on human systems due to, we were just talking before about the heat wave going on. And that also has impacts on natural systems and how those impact humans. And some of those are going to be irreversible changes. And so we need to be very cautious about what warming we have at every point in time to help us avoid those risks. When we talk right now about like 1.5 degree scenarios, I think it's important to talk about what those numbers actually, those Celsius numbers kind of mean in those models, which is it's talking about our temperature in 2100. It's not talking about the curvature of our temperature from here to there. And depending on what model we're looking at, they can vary wildly, right? You can have a 1.5 scenario with high overshoot, which means we go a lot higher than 1.5. And then we slowly come back down to 1.5. And maybe at 2100, we are on a downward or stable trajectory of 1.5. If you look at some of the 3 or 4 degree C models at 2100, those usually still have upward slopes at 2100, right? It's not actually saying that those models would have us quote unquote stabilize. That would also be a very unstable state, but stabilize at 3 or 4 degrees, whatever those models are. It's actually saying that at this point in time in 2100, that's where we'd roughly be expected to be. But in those cases, they're usually still on an upward trajectory.
I'm kind of curious, for those of our listeners who are new to methane, could you tell us a little bit about where does methane come from? Why, how much of it is anthropogenic? How much is natural? Why is this becoming such a big problem?
Most of the elevated methane emissions are anthropogenic. There have always been natural emissions from systems like wetlands, and there's a little bit from termites, which is a fun fact. Most of the elevated emissions today are anthropogenic, and those come from a few different sectors. Agriculture is a very big sector, primarily driven by livestock as well as rice. Oil and gas is about the next kind of third, largely coming from leaks in different operational practices and different sort of industrial processes actually just do have some methane emissions related to them today. And there's also a number of waste sectors. So landfills are a big generator of methane, as are wastewater systems. So these categories are fairly different than the CO2 categories. Obviously high overlap in oil and gas. But when we talk about CO2, we're not as focused on agriculture and waste usually. And I think this is part of the shift that has to happen, is really recognizing all of the different sectors that are contributing to climate change right now and emissions, and making sure that we have plans on engaging with all of them.
Yeah. I'm curious because, you're talking to carbon dioxide removal nerds. I got introduced to carbon dioxide through my master's degree, where I spent measuring carbon fluxes using the eddy covariance technique over mixed urban ecosystems. And then I was like, whoa, CO2, this is fascinating. You took a different trajectory and you ended up at methane. And I'm really curious how you decided to care about methane and engage with methane, and then why you decided to found Spark, and then what you guys are doing at Spark to address methane.
Yeah, so the way I got to methane was really trying to understand all the different pieces of what needed to happen and what was happening, and methane coming up as needing to be a very large priority given its large role in overall warming, and particularly having this really important role in helping us to mitigate near-term temperatures and peak temperatures that needed to happen quickly in order for it to achieve that role. And seeing that we are really behind on being able to achieve those goals for a wide number of reasons. But we are only now having this so-called methane moment, which is wonderful. I'm so glad we're here, and that it is getting more attention. But the work is in its relatively early days, especially compared to many parts of CO2 related work. And one of the resulting challenges in the methane space right now is that we don't have a full suite of ready solutions to deploy. So there's really important work going into deploying the solutions that we do have. And also there's a lot of innovation needed in order to more fully flesh out the portfolio of things that we can do to mitigate the rest of the anthropogenic emissions for which we don't have solutions. The other piece of methane overall, you were asking before about anthropogenic versus natural emissions. Right now, anthropogenic emissions are the vast majority of elevated methane emissions. However, due to our current kind of warming trajectory, there are increasing risks and increasing evidence that is starting to happen of natural systems emitting more methane. And that's a risk that hasn't been fully incorporated into our IPCC modeling, where there are really high scientific uncertainties still, and we don't really have anything directly to do about it, which is sort of additionally scary. So tons of work on methane needs to happen across all different flavors of work, from innovation to policy change and incentivization to actually making the changes on the ground. And so one of the big motivators for starting Spark was to be able to focus on a few of the sectors related to unmitigated or not fully mitigated risks that we saw in the system that weren't yet getting the level of attention that would give us comfort that those risks would be resolved by existing efforts. And that led us to methane as a really important near-term priority. And so the two areas that we've been focused on so far to date have been enteric methane mitigation. So this is colloquially cow burps. It's roughly a third of our methane emissions are just from cow burps. And then we're also looking at atmospheric methane removal, which is potentially of particular interest to the carbon dioxide removal folks listening to this podcast, which is trying to understand if there are ways that we might be able to accelerate the atmospheric methane sink, in some ways analogous to the carbon sinks, but different given how the molecule acts differently, in order to help draw down some of that warming from historical methane emissions faster than natural systems would alone, as well as build a tool that could be deployed on top of methane emissions reductions in order to help mitigate some of the impact of elevated natural methane emissions for which we don't currently have any other immediate solutions.
There's a lot to ask about here, but maybe we'll cut to the chase for our listeners' sake, and then we'll roll the clock back here and start at the beginning. But I've always heard that methane is both more dilute in the atmosphere and ambient air than carbon dioxide, and it's also a less reactive molecule than carbon dioxide. So it's harder than carbon dioxide to actually practice active removal. Are those things true or no?
It is absolutely more dilute. That is somewhat made up for by how much more potent it is on a per molecule basis. For a given volume of air, going back to your radiative forcing comment before, you do have more radiative forcing from CO2 than from methane in volume of air, but it's methane is a pretty significant chunk. Methane is actually very reactive, which is why we do see that it has this short-lived dynamic in the atmosphere, is that it is undergoing these reactions, but it is a lot harder to capture. So whereas for carbon dioxide, we think about capturing that molecule and then storing it, for methane, we really think about how do we sort of catalytically convert it. And
Destruction is what I've always heard, right?
Just destroy it, convert it to, again, primarily water and CO2 are the byproducts of those reactions.
That's where we've come from, right? It's been primarily one of methane destruction is a term I've heard for years and years at this point. It's not necessarily a new idea, especially with landfills being able to like flare off the gas that's collected. That's pretty common. There's probably other things that we've done with methane emissions to date too. I've heard of feeding seaweed to cows. Various types of seaweed can reduce the methane burps here. Are there other things like that that are either waiting to be scaled or have already been tried but are not enough? Like, where have we started and where are we going with methane?
So there are lots of available solutions that we need to be deploying as quickly as we can. And basically every sector has some portion of the emissions that are able to be addressed today. Those are going to obviously vary by sector as to what they are, but you brought up landfill flaring. So when we think about existing solutions for destroying methane, those really apply to high concentrations of methane emissions. So flaring, for example, combustion works at, we have to have at least 4% methane in that airstream. And there are some other technologies that bring that concentration requirement down, but still don't address many emission sources. There are things that we can do upstream of that, though, before we talk about flaring or combusting it in different ways to avoid that methane being generated in the first place. There are behavioral changes that we can make to avoid methane being generated in the first place. So, for example, diverting food waste from landfills helps to prevent that food from then becoming methane in the landfill and being leaked. So that's kind of the most upstream thing we can do. And then there are ways that we can, even sort of without that behavior change, in some cases, that we can prevent that methane from being created or being emitted to the atmosphere. And so the seaweed example you brought up is for cows, for enteric emissions. This is cow burps, basically. There are some things that are being studied that we might be able to feed to cows that would change their digestive systems such that they were producing less methane. Seaweed is being studied. There's a feed additive called 3-NOP that is being deployed in Europe right now. There are other just changes in kind of overall feed ratios that can be made without any additives. And then there's a lot of research going into other methods that may be helpful here as well. And so, yeah, across categories, there's a portion of things that we can do, but there are these really large categories where we don't have ready solutions yet. And so one of those is grazing cows. We don't yet have a way for a cow that isn't constantly being fed something by a farmer, where a feed additive could be added in order to bring those methane emissions down. And so there are these kind of really large innovation categories across sectors that will help us to add ready solutions to the portfolio that can, once they're ready, also be deployed and further enable us to bring our anthropogenic emissions down.
I know you have more to say, but I love the idea that feedlots, just because they have food additives that can be done in a centralized kind of way, may end up creating, at least on one metric, a more ecological beef product. It's going to make everyone's head explode, and that's fun.
Is it though? Is it? I mean, or is it small potatoes in comparison to like reducing the amount of livestock on the planet? Period. Like,
yeah. Like all the runoff is all toxic, and there's a bunch of it's by one metric only. But
all of these systems have many trade-offs that need to be looked at, very holistically, so that we don't optimize systems around any single metrics that might blind us to the full ecosystem and system impact that we're having.
Sorry, Erika, I heard the one little factoid that now I'm going to repeat at parties for the next 3 decades. So please don't add unnecessary nuance here. Thank you. That's all. Where are we headed though? Like, oh, sorry, should we go ahead?
No, go ahead. Where are we headed? And kind of what's Spark's role here? Because it seems like there's a lot of research needed. You've sufficiently alarmed us in a good way. There's a high risk here. Doesn't seem like a whole lot's being done. What's Spark's role, and like where are you going with Spark, and what's your kind of immediate term mission there?
So fortunately, there is more and more being done on methane across the ecosystem, and so I want to make sure that that is clear. There are many players here who are doing really important work on all different sides of this equation, right? From innovation on new solutions to policy change to communication, et cetera. And so that's been really heartening to see scale up a lot more in the last few years, building on really important work that was started a few decades ago. So we're specifically focused on a few of these sectors to start, and when we hope to add more over time as we have bandwidth to do so, where we see many more kind of additional efforts needed to be added, and in a role that we can sort of play with a particular focus right now on major innovation areas. And so our long-term goal is to help accelerate the pathway to being able to repair the climate by developing, supporting the development of new solutions and solution ecosystems to provide more options for deployment down the road, particularly around where we have these types of risks. So we've been really focused recently on helping to build this field of atmospheric methane removal, which is really looking at this question of, are there ways of accelerating methane sinks from the atmosphere, which could play an important role in addressing historical methane emissions, as well as these risks of rising natural emissions. And just in general, given where we're at, any new tools that we can have that will bring down radiative forcing over time and help to manage temperatures will be incredibly valuable. It's a very early field, and so we're really focused right now on helping to support the scale up of research around a number of ideas that scientists have had that haven't yet been fully explored, to see what might be possible here, what we might have to add to the portfolio, while also starting to look at how do we ensure that as those solutions potentially get proven out scientifically, that we're able to pave a way towards good governance and sort of supportive and appropriate policy to ensure that these solutions are as additive as possible. We're also starting to scale up our work in enteric methane. So about a year ago, we started doing some road mapping, and the need for solution development and research funding came up. And so we've been doing some work there, but we're finally building a much larger team around this and have more dedicated time on it. And so we're working on building right now what that strategy is and where to focus. It's a different state of a field. A lot more is already happening, which is really exciting to see. And we're also convinced that a lot more needs to happen, and any role that we can play in helping to identify what those remaining gaps are in field development and helping to fill them, be that through additional philanthropic funding or spinning up new projects, we think will be really additive to ensuring that all of our bases are covered in these fields to give them their best shot at fulfilling the need we kind of need them to fill in order to mitigate our overall climate risk.
What is the state of methane removal right now? Are there direct air capture prototypes being built right now that actually capture methane from ambient air? Is it something that parallels carbon removal, or is it very different from someone familiar with carbon removal such that they wouldn't even recognize it to date?
There's a number of different approaches that are being discussed. Different levels of research have gone into different of them. And they really widely vary. And so some of them actually may be some of the same solutions as carbon dioxide removal, and some of them are going to look very, very different. But overall, just given how much, given when focus on this field started on the research side, we're in our very, very early days. And so we don't yet know what that portfolio of solutions will be and which ones are going to pan out. The ones that may end up overlapping heavily with carbon dioxide removal are some of the soil-based approaches. So one of our current methane sinks are soils. It's a relatively small sink, about 5%-ish of methane that enters into the atmosphere is sucked down by methanotropes in soil. But some of the changes that we might look at for carbon sequestration, like biochar, enhanced rock weathering, may also impact the soil bacteria that are generating or consuming methane. And so one really important thing that we should all be aware of whenever we make any of these changes is that these systems are all complex and can change lots of different things, including different greenhouse gases. And fortunately, sometimes these things come as co-benefits. But no matter what approach we're studying, we need to sort of make sure we understand the full suite of impacts to make sure we're not, producing methane while drawing down CO2 or vice versa, and then looking for those opportunities where we can draw down both, which seems like there may be some.
Look,
Yeah,
I get it. Oh, no, you go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
I'm thinking, is it worth talking about removal or disruption, if we're going to call it that, or conversion when we're talking? And I feel like I'm becoming my own worst enemy because I always hate it when people say, should we even talk about carbon removal? Shouldn't we just focus on decarbonization? And I'm going to do that to you, and I apologize. But because it's such a short-lived gas, is it really just about avoiding as opposed to removing?
Oh man, I love it. You really set yourself up perfectly.
I'm really my own villain here.
This is a great question, and it's a common question. And yes, if you emit methane, it will decay over the course of a few decades. And yet, despite that, we are already seeing 0.5 degree and rising of temperature increase from methane. And unfortunately, we are not on a trajectory to have that go down. Our atmospheric methane levels are still accelerating. And so I think the most basic answer to that question is, if we care about the current warming that we see, and if we care about the warming that we see until this magical day when all of elevated natural emissions and anthropogenic emissions go away, then we should absolutely care about any tools that we may be able to add to the portfolio that help to draw down or break down that 0.5 degree and growing of warming as quickly as we can, which atmospherically we are depending on those atmospheric levels going down in order to achieve any of our targets. And so I think this partially comes back to, how much emphasis we put on near-term versus long-term warming, and what those trajectories actually mean. The unfortunate reality is, given where we're at, our trajectory really does matter. And every tool that we could be deploying here that can be additive can play an important role in bringing down overshoot and our overall peak temperatures, which have numerous impacts on natural system feedbacks and tipping points where it's not only our long-term trajectories here that matter. And given sort of perturbation of natural systems, if we don't do everything we can to keep temperatures down, we're also at increasing risk over time of higher and higher natural system emissions, not only on methane, but also on carbon dioxide from these systems. And so we're setting ourselves up to be sort of hiking a taller and taller mountain here on how much carbon dioxide removal, how much methane removal could be needed down the road. And so every ounce of preventative action is valuable in trying to shift that trajectory.
My favorite question of this show. I feel like you've been carrying that around in your soul for however long you've been involved in CDR, Siobhan, and now you got to spring the trap on someone else.
There you
And
go.
what was
There
it
you
like
go.
being
But
on the
that was
other
a
side
really,
of it?
but that was a really good
That's
answer.
good, yeah,
And
it was.
I liked that you framed it in terms of like, if we care about this stuff, I'm going to start saying that more often. It's like, well, I don't know. Do we care about 1.5 degrees? Do we care about 2 degrees? If so, we have to care about carbon removal. And it sounds like methane removal and it's all solutions, right? It definitely feels like you and Spark in general has a very yes and approach. And I think that's true of a lot of climate solutions, right? I mean, we all have to go in with like this yes and approach. And so I think obviously bringing that to methane is really important. Man, the potency is really getting me, because I had read all these statistics around 80 times. But when you point out that, fresh out of the source, we're talking about 120 times, it really makes me rethink. So for our listeners who don't know, Erika kindly called us out on our memes channel and was like, "You're not doing any methane memes." And ask and you shall receive. We responded with a methane meme. And now I'm thinking it wasn't potent enough. Like I didn't do a good enough job illustrating.
It wasn't 80 times as good as a single CO2 meme.
Exactly, right?
Wow, that's a high bar. Your job is really hard, I'm realizing now. Yeah.
But man, that's really, potency is just wow. We really need to get methane under control.
We sure do. We're all depending on that and many other things going right. So as long as we can all continue on, each of these important things in parallel, we've got a shot. But are there a lot of challenges that we all need to be figuring out how to tackle right now.
What about the third greenhouse gas of nitrous oxide? What's the status of that? Are people thinking about removing that? I've heard mumblings about it, but I feel like it's the people who are really bleeding edge and trying to find something that is kind of blue sky and any other business turns of phrases that may apply here. What's going on with that? Do you know?
Not as much as methane removal, which is definitely not as much as carbon dioxide removal, kind of in the order of size of impact on the atmosphere. So also follows focus on removal. We haven't had a large focus on not nitrous oxide removal. There's a lot of work to do on nitrous oxide reduction for sure.
Like dentist offices, right?
No.
Somewhere else.
Largely agriculture. I don't think dentists fit into agriculture category, but someone will probably correct me on that. Our overall warming impact from nitrous oxide is important and also unfortunately growing, and yet also much smaller than either carbon dioxide or methane. And so if you think about any approaches that are going to require air movement and the energy cost of that, then you'll be getting much less climate impact from just nitrous oxide than you would from just methane or just carbon dioxide. There may be ways of combining some of these systems, perhaps, if you are able to actually have a process that would capture or convert that nitrous oxide at sort of low overall climate cost, right? It's like low energy cost. I have yet to see any proposals for how that might be done in a way that would be sort of cost plausible and climate beneficial. There may be natural systems approaches. This hasn't been an area that I have dug a bunch into, given just how much work we see to do on methane removal right now, and the much higher overall impact that methane currently has in the atmosphere compared to nitrous oxide.
Yeah. Erika, what do you think for our listeners who want to get involved or who want to make policy or advocate for policy or want to start research? What's the most impactful area right now in methane? Is it just getting the facts down on paper? Is it still in the research phase, or what's something people can interact with?
So on methane overall, we need to be all hands on deck on figuring out how we cut methane emissions. And there are lots of different places to plug in there. There are there are many existing solutions for some of those sectors that we need to figure out how to deploy them faster. And depending on the sector, that might take business model innovation, finance innovation, technical innovation, awareness building for different behavioral changes, etc. So tons of places to get involved in methane mitigation or methane emissions avoidance. And within methane, that is absolutely our sort of the first front of the methane fight is cutting emissions. When we talk about the removal space, given the current state, it really is right now focused on sort of really fundamental research to understand what these methods are and advance the science around them. And so at this stage, I think there are fewer places to get as directly involved outside of more of the sort of academia policy type angles. And that work right now is incredibly important and still very in its early small days. But there's a wider variety of activities on the methane emission side, methane emissions reduction side, depending on people's backgrounds, which may offer more different ways of plugging in.
I have one final question as we near the conclusion, which is, Erika, can methane be stored in aluminium?
I've never heard that.
Just like the way that British people say both of those words. Methane?
Oh, methane? Sorry, I missed that. I missed the methane. I just got the aluminium. Like, what kind of question is that?
We're in the bad part of the show, which often gets cut, by the way. It always goes one joke further than it really needs to. And then you're like, cool, we're going to cut 5 minutes ago and wrap it there. But where can people follow your work? I'm going to try and save it now. Where can people follow your work, Erika, if they want to stay involved with Spark and you personally?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter, and you can find Spark on Twitter as well. You can learn more about Spark and these fields on our website. That's sparkclimate.org. I think our Twitter handle is @sparkclimate, super original. And we have a newsletter, which we occasionally send things out to. But there's a lot of information on our website right now, particularly on really understanding what the different approaches are that are being researched for atmospheric methane removal. If anyone wants to jump deep down the nerd hole of what these approaches are, what some of their trade-offs might be, and what the innovation areas are that would be required to help see them through to fruition. We have a lot more coming on that front as well, which we will update our newsletter about, as well as our Twitter. Really looking at high priority research areas and research questions that need to be answered, and some roadmaps for the field. And so those are additional places for folks to engage, particularly who are on the the science and R&D side. We'll be helping to highlight where we see some of the highest leverage needs to help sort of further illuminate where people can get involved in different ways.
One other question that came up too, I felt I had to catch myself. I'm so used to saying carbon removal when I'm talking to a methane specialist. Should I be saying carbon dioxide removal? Do you think we should be pedantic and really insist that we're talking about a specific gas? Or is it just carbon removal when it's inclusive of all of them? Is that the taxonomy here?
I don't think you should be pedantic between carbon removal and carbon dioxide removal. I think carbon removal at this point is largely understood to be carbon dioxide removal. Usually when we talk about greenhouse gas wide or agnostic removal, we say greenhouse gas removal or negative emissions technologies to avoid that confusion. And so, to use the umbrella term, you can use either of those, and then not then have to remind ourselves that yes, indeed, methane does have carbon in it, which it sure does.
Yeah, don't want to be that person. Well, thanks both for coming and hanging out. It was fun. Got some laughs in there. Even snuck one by Erika there at the end with a confusing.
I don't know if that joke is going to make it. I don't know if that one's going to make the cut.
That's going to be too hard to edit out now. There's too many allusions to it. It's saved. It's in there now. I'm no longer
in there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.